Chapter 13. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. You yourself are what you're looking for. When I left the church for the sake of love, huge energies of longing that had been repressed my entire life were activated before I had the spiritual wisdom to navigate them. In India, they tell the story of the musk deer, which catches a hint of sweet fragrance and runs after it, not knowing that the fragrance comes from a secretion within its own abdomen. Well, this indeed was my predicament. I was chasing after every hint of love. A high, a place to call home, an erotic attraction, a wild adventure, thinking that love were elsewhere. Like the musk deer, I didn't know that the sweetness was inside of me, inside the heart of hearts. And so my constant chasing after something else always ended in more longing. Finally, at age 39, life dropped me at the doorstep of my spiritual teacher, and I heard the truth. You yourself are what you're looking for. I first encountered Dr. David R. Hawkins in a book recommended by my therapist. At the time I entered therapy, I was sinking into what Viktor Frankl called an existential vacuum. In outer terms, my life was going just fine. Love had healed that essential deep part of me. The panic attacks were gone. I could speak freely, even in front of hundreds of people, even millions on national television. I was open to life, much more accepting of myself and others. My partner and I had left the church. We were creating a whole new life together. It was difficult to do so without the sanction and support of a church community, but the freedom to be authentic, it was so enlivening. I enjoyed new levels of friendship, creative life. I was pretty happy. I was living closer to my heart. I was truer to my nature. Professionally, I was also successful. I had received tenure at a different university where I could offer the best parts of myself, and I was given freedom to grow. So, in summary, in those previous several years, I had come through a major earthquake and rebuilt my life on a whole new foundation. I had a new family, new friends, new house, new job. So the outer parts of life, they seemed solid. But internally, my spirit was restless. Unbeknownst to me, I had rebuilt my life on the same fault line as before, a longing for love and thinking it was outside of myself. So there was an inner uneasiness that gnawed inside of me. I was drinking too much. I was gaining a lot of weight. I was in the love relationship that had healed so much for me. But inexplicably, I still felt restless for romance. Should I be with somebody else? I was exhausting myself with over-socializing and overworking. That old desperation for approval, it hadn't gone away. That lifelong inferiority, it made it difficult for me to be really vulnerable. Despite being surrounded by friends, I felt alone. I felt no one really knows me. And if they did know me, they probably wouldn't like me. In the academic domain of being a professor, where skills of logic and argument reigned, I felt inferior because I'm a feeling intuitive typology. Like a very short person trying to make it in professional basketball, the rules of engagement just didn't favor my assets. I dealt with the pain of that self-deficiency through various distractions and addictive habits. So I had had the courage to change my whole life for love. The healing had been profound and oh, so necessary. So why now this inner longing for something more? It was gnawing at me. This period of confusion did end up serving a purpose. As my spiritual teacher told me, the mature spiritual aspirant is one who has explored the ego's options and false promises of happiness. The ego's final song, after examination, is represented by a famous singer's poignant song, "Is That All There Is?" Modern physics tells us that these vacuum states are dynamic. They're full of creative forces. This was certainly true of the existential vacuum I found myself in. An influx of spiritual wisdom came from Buddhist teachers such as Jetsunla Tenzin Palmo, Pema Chodron, and Joanna Macy. From Buddhism, I learned meditation methods that helped me to sort out truth from illusion. When I met with her, Tenzin Palmo told me, quote, "Inherently, you have Buddha nature. That's our true nature. But because of our delusion, we often act more like demons. We create so much suffering for ourselves and for the world around us. Through meditation, I work to cultivate more wholesome habits of thought." Tenzin Palmo told me, "Listen, it's like weeding the garden. You water good plants and you pull out the weeds. That way, through meditation, gradually the mind and heart begin to unpollute." I found loving kindness meditation, metta bhavana, to be especially effective. Loving kindness meditation reduced my anger at the church leaders for having rejected me. Much to my surprise, Tenzin Palmo told me that loving kindness had to start with myself. She said, "Until you love yourself, you can't love others. It would just be a dependency." These principles and practices from Buddhism gave me a life raft while I felt lost at sea. As I understood it at the time, Buddhism didn't require any kind of belief in God or transcendent being. And this fit with my agnosticism. I had left the church in order to say yes to love. I knew that love was real. That light, capital L, had been incredible. But God? I wasn't so sure. The word itself made me uneasy because I had seen it used in so many unloving ways. My agnosticism was a humble position that acknowledged the probable existence of something greater without calling it God. I was going through a process of partial atheism, you might say, in which the God I had been brought up to believe in had become dead to me. That God had been little more than a child's projection of a punitive parent. The child felt guilty for being bad and feared punishment from the great big parent in the sky. This childish image of God had to die. It had nothing to do with love. It was infantile ego projection. It was not the great reality. Sigmund Freud was correct to state that such anthropomorphic projections onto God were surely fallacious. But Freud's final conclusion was not my own. Just because the negative projections of God were not true didn't mean that there was no higher power at all. I found hope in Gandhi's description of the real capital R as an indefinable, mysterious power that pervades everything. His inner experiences led him to say, quote, "I do dimly perceive that whilst everything around me is ever changing, ever dying, there is, underlying all of that change, a living power that is changeless, that holds all things together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates, and that informing power or spirit is God. Gandhi would ask, is this power benevolent or malevolent? He saw this power as purely benevolent based on his own observations. For example, he said, in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. Hence, I gather that God is life, truth, and light. God is love. He is the supreme good. For myself, I was hoping that one day I would come to know this God of light, of truth, and of love. For God to be God, he, or maybe she, had to have that same quality of love that had been infused in the light, capital L, that I had experienced so beautifully at age 15. Light to light. A year into psychotherapy, I began to feel more real. Some of my walls had come down. I had lost weight. I had gotten more honest with myself and with others, and I felt happier. I remember asking my therapist, is there anything I can read about this process? I wanted to understand, what did she mean by levels of consciousness and energy fields? She replied, you could read Power versus Force by Dr. David R. Hawkins. Well, I'd never heard of him before. And when that book arrived, I took a glance at the author photo on the back and sighed. Another white man? My politics at that time led me to take a dim view of men. So I tossed the book aside. It was the middle of a busy college semester, and I had student papers to read. Then the day after Christmas, I opened the book to its last section, about the author. It was a brief spiritual autobiography. As I read it, I became unexpectedly magnetized, as if some switch inside of me had been turned off for my entire life, and now, suddenly, it turned to on. I heard myself say, my God, this is the real deal. He was a fire, and I was like a moth drawn to that flame. I was faintly aware that my life as I knew it was going to end. As a scholar, I had studied and taught about mystics for many years. Mystics like Marguerite Porete, Meister Eckhart, Dogen, Ramakrishna, Hildegard, Saint Teresa of Avila, Rumi, and others. But I'd never encountered one in real life. This author's experiences reached out to me from the pages as if I were actually reading about the innermost part of my very own self that had been long forgotten. It was as if I weren't learning something new, but remembering something true. Two of his experiences really electrified me. The first one winter day when he was 12. He was biking a 17-mile paper route, and a storm hit with gusting winds at 20 below zero. The wind knocked over his little bicycle, and he fell on the frozen ground. He dug out a hollow in the snowbank along the road. He was freezing, but he soon experienced a timeless and gentle presence of overwhelming love. He said, soon the shivering stopped. There was a delicious warmth and then a state of peace beyond all description. This was accompanied by a suffusion of light and a presence of infinite love, which had no beginning and no end. It was undifferentiated from my own essence. My mind grew silent. All thought stopped. An infinite presence was all that was or ever could be, beyond all time, beyond all description. When I read this, I remembered my own experience of the light, capital L, at age 15. I sensed that he had discovered the source of himself and that it was also my source. At 16, despite that early experience of infinite love, he rejected the idea of God. He was walking through the woods one day and was hit with a sudden revelation of the absolute horrible suffering of human beings throughout all of time. And in that moment, he blamed God, and he became an atheist. Yet deep inside, he was still driven by an intense quest to reach the truth about existence. He was blessed with a good mind, and he easily mastered the world of science and the intellect. Other teenage boys his age played stickball. They read comic books, while he listened to the weekly opera program and he read Shakespeare and Plato. He completed medical school while holding down 3 jobs. He became the head psychiatrist running a large hospital, publishing a plethora of scientific articles. To all appearances, he was very successful. He had the largest psychiatric practice in New York State, owned luxurious homes, enjoyed membership in elite social circles. On a personal level, he had gone through many years of psychoanalysis with one of the leading Freudians of the time. And yet, all of his investigations brought only deeper despair. At the pinnacle of worldly success, he was confronted with a vast and wayless inner darkness. This crisis culminated in 1965 when he was 38. He was at the point of death due to a progressive illness. He likened the agony of his existential despair to Dante's Inferno, where there's a sign posted that reads, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." He described this hopelessness, that it was forever. All of his efforts to pursue the meaning of existence through his intellect had failed. He said, "I was in extremis. I knew I was about to die. I didn't care about the body, but my spirit was in a state of extreme anguish and despair. As the final moment approached, the thought flashed through my mind, what if there is a God? And with that, I called out a prayer. If there is a God, I ask him to help me now," and surrendered totally to whatever God there might be. He immediately went into an oblivion. It was so intense, it took him 30 years to recount the earth-shattering aftermath of this experience. And here is what he said about it. "When I awoke from that oblivion, a transformation of such enormity had taken place, I was struck dumb with awe. The person that I had been no longer existed. There was no longer any personal self, no ego. There was only an infinite presence of unlimited power, that it was all that was. This presence had replaced what had been a me. and the body and its actions were controlled solely by the infinite will of the presence. The world was illuminated by the clarity of an infinite oneness that expressed itself as all things revealed their infinite beauty and perfection. In the wake of his transfiguration of consciousness, all of life was revealed in its timeless beauty and oneness. He described it like this: the incredible beauty of all things shone forth. Where the world saw ugliness, I saw only timeless beauty. The spiritual love suffused all perception and all boundaries between here and there, or then and now. All separation disappeared. His book, Power versus Force, which had been suggested by my therapist, was published 30 years after he had this experience. It took him 30 years to integrate that experience and to present it in a book in a way that would be helpful to others. As I was reading all of this in the book, it was stunning to me. It revealed the pure, eternal essence of human beings and the oneness and allness at the heart of life. He took no credit for his discoveries. He said the experience had been given to him. He called it a gift of grace, not an achievement. He told me, in that state, there's no person left. You can't claim anything. Whatever terminology is used for this kind of experience, maybe oneness, the kingdom of heaven, self-realization, Buddha nature, God consciousness. This state of completion is within all of us, he told me. He said, when the clouds are removed, the sun shines forth. What a shock for me to realize that this love that I had looked for my whole entire life had always been within me. As he said to me, you yourself are what you're looking for. Still, at that time in my life, a male spiritual teacher was the last thing on my mind. It had never occurred to me to look for a teacher. I had no familiarity with gurus. If anything, I viewed them as highly suspect. I harbored hurt over how religious authorities had rejected my inner life. They had denied my soul's longing for love. They had rejected my experience of the light. Yet, underneath those hurts, my soul had evidently been searching for a pillar of light. And this is how it's described by Sufi teacher Llewellyn Vaughan Lee. He writes, we're looking for a pillar of light, a place of light in the world. They say traditionally it's actually the teacher that looks for the light of the disciple. But it's the same thing. A path or a teacher is a connection of light. You can see it clearly in the inner world. It's a pillar of light in the darkness of the world. You are looking somewhere. You're continually scanning the horizon in your world. It can be years, even decades, and then your attention is taken to a place of light, and there you lock on. Your radar locks on. It might not be immediately, but eventually you find your way to that path, to that tradition, to that teacher that is this light. This is the simplicity of finding the path that's right for you. Because your light resonates with the light of that teacher or that path that is right for you. It's the resonance of light to light. And that's exactly how it was as I read Power versus Force. My radar locked on. It was light to light. My light resonated with his light. Dr. Hawkins taught that the light was the self, capital S, not the person of the teacher. He said, it's not a person who is the teacher, but the self, capital S, inside the teacher. By analogy, it's not the lighthouse that guides the ships. It's the light shining from the lighthouse. One is free to pursue the light or not. Neither the light nor the lighthouse has any stake in the matter. Religions tend to deify the lighthouse at the price of the light. When I finished reading Power versus Force, I said to myself, finally, after 20 years, I understand the light. Finally, I know that God is love and that love is the greatest power in the universe. This changes everything. For me, it was a total paradigm shift, as if I had exited the elevator at a different floor. The world I saw was not the same world as before. The book validated the meaningfulness of my life and my search for truth, inseparable from love. It confirmed certain intuitions I'd had for most of my life, such as the world is an interplay of different energies. They constellate into energy fields or levels of consciousness. So, for example, we commonly hear, birds of a feather flock together. I recognized the levels of consciousness on his map of consciousness as the classic stages of human inner evolution. They're found in the world's sacred literature. They're told about by philosophers, sages, and mystics throughout all the centuries. Yet this book, Power versus Force, was the first time I'd ever read a scientific work that confirmed these energy levels as actual, measurable attractor patterns. It was a compelling verification of right brain intuition through left brain knowledge. He said he'd written the work to comprehend the sudden transformation of consciousness that he himself had undergone. This is classically termed enlightenment, and he wanted to integrate it with scientific discovery and then put it into a format that the left brain of we Western readers could understand. He said that his book, Power versus Force, is the realm of the mystic communicated to the left brain. I immediately read his other books, The Eye of the I, Reality and Subjectivity, and in them I encountered the realm of the mystic. It was the same essence I'd encountered when reading the mystics in Professor Babinski's class in seminary, reading the mystics in the spiritual direction program. Except that now I was reading a mystical essence in the language of my own time. Swami Chiditmananda of India, who teaches Vedanta, he told me, yes, David Hawkins' books are essentially the same as the ancient Upanishads, yet written in our modern idiom. There's no difference between what he has experienced and discussed and what was said by the great sages and saints of India. I just felt relieved. Finally in my life, a restlessness was relieved. What I had been searching for my entire life was somehow given to me in the pages of his books. The search was over. I had found what I'd been looking for. As our story goes, the musketeer finally realized that the fragrance he smelled everywhere around him was actually inside of him. As I read these books, I remembered certain moments of oneness as a young person when I grew up along the Gulf of Mexico in Florida. My family lived in a nature preserve that was a wild bird refuge. In that place of pristine nature, the veils between this world and the other world were thin. I recalled my walks on the beach in the company of hundreds of birds. My destination was always the place where the river flowed into the sea. And somehow I knew it represented the destiny of my soul. In my teacher's books, it was repeated that the search for love ends always with the surrender of the self, the river, in to the self, capital S, the sea. The river ends in the sea. One time, as I walked the beach, no one was in sight. And at first, I passed by him. I thought it was a lump of sea debris. But then I turned back to look, and I saw, oh my, it's a large bird. He sat perfectly still, radiating. Only a slight turning of his head toward me. Was it an invitation? I sat down on the sand, about a foot away. I was close yet respectful, sort of like when you enter a great cathedral and devoted people are kneeling in prayer. I saw that this bird was injured. In fact, I sensed he was dying. At first, I fantasized I could do a bird rescue, be heroic, take the bird home and nurse it back to health. Yet this moment called for witnessing, simply being with. I sat still, and miraculously, I saw an otherworldly light pass between us across the sand. It was amazing, this light between us. The bird's serenity settled over me. It was a serenity of deep acceptance. And for a moment, we became as familiar as lovers enjoying a sunset. There was nothing to do. There was nothing to say. We watched another bird, a tiny little snowy plover, scamper back and forth across the sheen on twig-like legs, drilling its little beak into the sand as waves roll back and forth into the sea. The plover was hunting for sand fleas. So there we all were, eating, dying, sitting, watching. In the silence, all was understood, and all was one. The next morning, I ran back there to see the bird again, but only a carcass remained. And my teacher had told me, you can't kill life. It merely changes form. Life goes to life. My teacher had remembered many physical deaths. He said they were not an end to life, but rather the letting go of a form. So as a youth, having these kinds of experiences, I didn't have the language to articulate this awareness of oneness that I saw in nature. It was an awareness that different forms of life are breathed by the same life. I didn't tell anyone of these moments. I was simply aware of life's oneness until it got covered over by religious conditioning. The religion said that God is only up in heaven, far away from creation. And I was told it was hearsay to say that God was present within creation. As I read the books of Dr. Hawkins, the core of me that had searched for love was validated. Oh, this is a wonderful moment. Intuitively, it made sense that certain energy fields are positive while others are negative. And love is the greatest power in the universe. It validated that. It was obvious that the energy of Mother Teresa was different than the energy of Adolf Hitler. Most people's energy lay somewhere in between those two. So power versus force delineates two basic categories of energy. There's power, which has a positive and life-affirming effect. And then there's force, which has a negative effect. Dr. Hawkins illustrated the difference between them in the cases of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, both of whom radiated an inner power that brought down long-standing systems of oppression in a short amount of time. How could a prisoner break the system of apartheid, or a 90-pound devotee wearing only a loincloth bring the British Empire to its knees? What force cannot accomplish with all of its weaponry, the power of love does effortlessly. Power versus force resonates with common sense. We all know negativity drains, positivity uplifts. Positive energy feels like courage, willingness, acceptance, reasoning, love. These are much more powerful than negative energy feels like shame, apathy, fear, anger, and pride, because they're aligned with what is real. Love, for example, radiates a beneficial and healing effect, while fear constricts us, and it has a polarizing effect. Love moves us forward. Fear holds us back. Each energy field represents a view of life that makes sense to those at that level of consciousness. Have you noticed that endless arguments can go on between people who are at different levels, even in the same family or workplace? Because each person is actually seeing a different world based on their level of consciousness. If a person is wearing red-colored glasses, everything will appear red, no matter how strong the case presented by the ones wearing green-colored glasses. Is the world green or is it red? The world you see depends on the lens you're looking through. A lot of frustration can be eased when we realize that people aren't bad or stupid. They're simply seeing life the way they see it because of the lens they're looking through. And that lens is their level of consciousness. The consciousness level of love is visionary. It's inclusive. It's healing, self-giving. It's capable of long-lasting changes that uplift millions of people. Mandela, Gandhi. It's rare. Power versus force confirms that spiritual practices done with sincerity and devotion do have a beneficial effect. For example, the Native American sweat lodge, the Tibetan Buddhist prayer wheel, Christian labyrinth walking, Hindu ritual bathing in the Ganges River, Jewish prayers at the Wailing Wall, chanting Om. Most other spiritual practices have a devotional, beneficial effect. What was amazing to me in Power versus Force was this idea that it's not the form of the practice that's so important. It's the actual energy of it. The book said that the healing effect comes from the purity of the heart, the devotion, the reverence inside the person doing the practice. Also, that certain places and writings or pieces of art and music equally radiate that energy field of love with a beneficial effect. So it's not just that you have to be religious to radiate this effect. You could go to Stonehenge and feel it. You could go to Chartres Cathedral and be aware of it. A Tibetan Buddhist stupa. You could read the Heart Sutra, the Declaration of Independence. You could listen to Mozart, Louis Armstrong, go to the museum and see a painting by Rembrandt. Listen to the Ave Maria. The divine is found everywhere. Power versus Force presents this easy-to-grasp map of consciousness. It shows these different levels of consciousness, that some are negative and some are positive. Has nothing to do with religion, It simply shows that there's an arc of spiritual evolution from its basest expression, such as self-hatred, to its most sublime, which is infinite, unconditional love. On the map of consciousness, the energy fields at the bottom are things like guilt, hate, fear. At the top, it's energies of love. And these are the gateways to the great spiritual reality that people seek. It's the opening of the heart. The author, Dr. Hawkins, found that few people actually live at the level of love, even though it's discussed everywhere and really commercialized. The minority of people who radiate the energy field of love, they are very significant for all of humanity. Even though they are a minority, they sustain humanity as a whole. These are the Nelson Mandelas, the Viktor Frankls, the Mother Teresas of the world. They may be individual persons, but they radiate a huge beneficial impact on the rest of us. If the love is selfless, if the love is unconditional, it's more powerful. And the outer form of it doesn't matter. It could be a simple smile. It could be a homemade meal, a random act of kindness. You remember what Mother Teresa taught us in an earlier chapter. Do small things with great love, for it's not how much we do, but how much love we put into the doing. Something made or done or given or said with a genuine selfless love, no matter how small, it has the greatest impact. So for me, this was a major take-home message from the book Power versus Force, and it changed the entire course of my life. For now that I knew that the energy field of love was really the greatest hope for humanity, I made a conscious declaration to become a more loving person. And naively, I thought, well, this means I need to acquire something I don't have. Go out and get some love. But really, it simply meant to remove what I didn't need, which were the inner obstacles to love inside of me, like self-hatred, lack of forgiveness, guilt, fear. If I could get rid of those, then love could shine forth. For as Dr. Hawkins was always saying, when the clouds are removed, the sun shines forth. I wanted to go see the author, Dr. Hawkins. I knew I needed something I couldn't get just from a book. I needed that actual presence, like being close to a fire and feeling the warmth of it. From my many years of academic study of the mystics and the saints, I remembered that a spiritual seeker should seek an opportunity to be in the physical presence of that sage or saint. There's something about the aura of the teacher that has an effect on an open-hearted listener. In some circles, it's referred to as the grace of the guru or as a silent transmission. This is why spiritual seekers throughout history have gone on very long pilgrimage. They want to be in the presence of a Gandhi, a Ramana Maharshi, a Karmapa, the Dalai Lama, Sadhguru Vasudev, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, and others. Even after the body of a mystic or saint has died, one still seeks the effect of it. I mean, just look. Hundreds of thousands of devotees kiss the tombs of holy people, of Sufi saints. For example, when I went to India, to the tomb of Mother Teresa, I could feel that energy field of love. It was so palpable. People all around, including myself, were just weeping and weeping. Well, I drove to his seminar. Inside, I felt hopeful, but skeptical. Truth be told, I had tried a lot of spiritual and religious groups over the years. But they always ended up saying, you don't belong here. They may have advertised unconditional love, but I found that their love had a limit. There was always that except you. It excluded me because I was gay. So I was nervous. Is this going to turn out to be another disappointment? But still, I couldn't not go. I was a log longing for its fire. Bowing down to the light. Even now, as I read to you this moment when I heard him in person for the first time, it's impossible to capture the feeling of being in this environment of total safety for my soul. All of me, whatever I was and would ever become, felt fully received, fully loved. I felt totally free and totally looked after. It was the recognition of my own innate wholeness. He told us what people in the world really want is the recognition of who they really are on the highest level. To see that same self, capital S, that it radiates forth from within everyone. It heals people's feeling of separation. It brings about an inner feeling of peace. And to bring peace and joy to others is the gift of the benevolence of the presence. This was a magnetic moment for me. On the surface, he was a little old man who lectured and answered questions. He didn't dress or act like the stereotype of a spiritual teacher. He was married, wore ordinary clothes, told jokes, drank Pepsi and espresso, and he could talk like a sailor if the occasion called for it. He sought to be ordinary, not, quote, spiritual. He didn't use robes or rituals. He didn't act like a saint. No special incantations, no theatrics or miracles performed on stage. There was no organization to join or dues to pay. He told us the true teacher has no interest in special clothing, dramatic performance, names, or titles. There's no egotism that would care about such things. Teaching is a function, not a person, he told us. A friend of mine described his personality as a mixture of Einstein, the Buddha, and Mr. Magoo. It was a personality that interacted with the world in a comical, intelligent, compassionate, unexpected, piercing, and sometimes tough love way. It was love, he said, that animated the interface with other people. He said the self, capital S, seeks to make a healing contact with the self, capital S, of the person who's suffering. This same love, which is a quality of the self, capital S, seeks to contact the self, capital S, in everyone through writing, speaking, conveying information that might be useful. He was the pole that set the world aright for me. It was the most powerful bond of love I have ever experienced. It had nothing to do with romance. Now I have learned to not presume that other people would find him as helpful as I did. We know from being in school that different students are drawn to different teachers. Who knows the reason for this? And I don't presume that a teacher in physical form would be the answer for you. I've seen people awaken in other ways, through music, nature, support groups, love relationships or loss of them, cancer, etc. For reasons I still do not understand, it was an old male sage who opened my heart. The discovery of my teacher was profound. Maybe it's similar for an initiate in any field of learning to come upon that perfect coach or mentor or master. Just imagine a music composer who gets to meet Mozart, a physicist who meets an Einstein, a poet who meets Mary Oliver, painter who meets a Rembrandt. In the vast literature on the inner sciences, the principal requirement for a spiritual student is the guidance of a realized master. This is true for any field of endeavor, isn't it? When I was a competitive tennis player, I sought out the best tennis coach I could find. And in the realm of spiritual work, I sought out instruction and transmission from a realized master. So for other people, it was different. When we went to a public lecture to hear Dr. Hawkins, my partner left after the first hour. She said, this is not for me. This reaction was shocking and disappointing to me, quite honestly. But it gave me a needed lesson in trust and acceptance. Truly everyone finds what they need, and not all plants thrive in the same soil. This was the point made by Swami Vivekananda at the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893. He said, "Divinity knows the hearts of everyone and receives the love of those who seek truth. In the heart of everything, the same truth reigns." Jivan Mukta is the Sanskrit term for a being who's liberated while still living on earth. And that is what I knew my teacher to be, a liberated being, free, spontaneous, and crystal clear. He never sought followers. He had no interest in persuading others. "I'm not interested in big shotism," he said once. He simply shared what he knew to be true. He would say, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Though he appeared in the form of a man, he was somehow beyond gender. He was in the world, but not of it. His lectures gave our thinking minds something to pay attention to, but the real teaching unfolded in the depths of the self, capital S. It was silent, deep inside. He taught that the high energy field of the self is already present within the student. All that the teacher does is activate what's real within the student, like a tuning fork. As I was there, something activated inside of me. As often as I could, I went to his teachings and his satsangs. I sat, I listened, I read the books, I did the practices. And in that silence, my inner being was transformed. I learned from his words, but mostly it was his presence. It was his way of being that taught me. I went for 3 years. I watched people of all ages, all faiths, all races and countries go onto the stage and sit across from him. Many of them had a burning question. Some even had come across the whole entire world to ask it. They came from Africa, Korea, Japan, Ireland, India, Argentina, England, Australia, Norway, Egypt, China, Canada, Poland. They included Christians, agnostics, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Sufis, people from all walks of life. Do you see? Something about him made everyone feel at home. Now, if you could ask a question of such a self-realized being, what would it be? A Hindu woman from India, she wanted to know, how do I concentrate my mind on the divine? A 20-something rock musician from Texas wanted to know, how do I avoid the seductions of fame and drugs and money? There was a local woman who channeled spirits from the other side. She wanted to know, can I trust the entities speaking through me? A Buddhist nun wanted to know, why did I come all the way here from Asia to hear you and I can't even understand English? A Christian man wanted to know, are miracles real, like the ones that Jesus did? A middle-aged woman wanted to know, how can I ever forgive the man who molested me when I was a child? So many different questions. And he answered each one with compassion and skill. Each person was addressed uniquely in their deepest unspoken need. His answers to the same questions sometimes differed. He was speaking to the psyche and the spiritual level of the person who asked the question. Many people would go up and say, thank you, or can I just sit here and look into your eyes? It's the only time I've ever experienced unconditional love. People ask for his blessings on all kinds of things. A father took his young son up to the platform and asked, could you please touch my son? A pregnant teenager and her mother, they asked, could you please touch her belly? Newly married couples wanted a blessing on their marriage. And people went up with many different kinds of gifts. They gave him stuffed animals. They gave him baked goods, paintings they had made, plants, even ice cream one time. They sang him songs, they told jokes, they poured out their gifts and they poured out their hearts. He never asked for anything. He received their loving gestures because they needed to give them, not because he needed to have them. One time I saw a Buddhist nun from South Korea quickly grab the food that he had left on his plate. And she turned to me and said, in my country, it's a blessing to eat from the plate of a master. I'd never heard or seen such a thing. But I did understand this nun's hunger for that energy of love that was just so palpable in him. When Hindu people came from India, they prostrated and touched his feet. I'd never been inclined to those kinds of things, but in this case, oddly, prostration felt completely correct. There's a saying in Sufism, to be less than dust at the feet of the teacher. And I knew instinctively that this was not submission in a self-effacing way like we say in patriarchal culture. It was a surrender of the heart of the student to the heart of the teacher who abides within the heart of God. So inwardly, I offered my whole life as a prostration of my heart to his heart, which was in the heart of God. It was the ultimate yes to love. It wasn't a yes to the person of the teacher, but to the core of love within him. So you see, once again, love in my life was peering to me in a specially rejected form. I couldn't explain to others this surge of devotion within my heart. I was breaking not only a religious orthodoxy like I had when I fell in love with a woman, but now I was breaking a secular orthodoxy as well. Love for a spiritual teacher, a guru, this was nowhere in my background. It was completely unacceptable for an academic to bow before a spiritual teacher. I thought, maybe I'll lose my career from the lofty halls of academe. You're allowed to study a guru with objective distance, but it's heresy to become a devotee. I felt alone, very alone in my experience, but I also felt certain of the truth of it. This unconditional love from my teacher had opened up my heart, and the experience of that kind of love is irresistible. Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, the Sufi teacher, would tell me later, One of the things that happens when you come to a spiritual teacher and you're loved for yourself unconditionally, your warts and all, people have never experienced anything like that. And the teacher doesn't want anything from you. In Sufism, this moment is called tauba. It's the turning of your heart toward God, who is love. And it's then that the soul begins its real journey home. Without a guide on the path, that journey is not possible. And I had found my guide. After 3 years of sitting there listening in the audience, I longed to express my heart and to go up and receive my teacher's blessing. So during the Q&A portion at the end of one of the seminars, I went forward and I stood in line. I was nervous about expressing something so intimate in front of hundreds of people, but this was the only opportunity to interact with him. It was in those public gatherings. When it was my turn, I walked onto the stage and sat in front of him. I felt that melting love again. It was the same as that of the light, capital L. The unique quality of that kind of pure love is that it needs nothing. It only gives. It radiates like the sun. As I looked at him across the small round table, it was unsettling. His eyes looked back at me without the customary veil or hesitation or intent. It's like there was no person looking back at me. Looking into his eyes, there was no inner person. This is impossible to explain, really. Never before had I looked into someone's eyes and not found an inner person looking back at me that has its feelings, needs, and ideas. It's like he was an empty space. He was a presence, not a person. The basic thing about a spiritual teacher is that they're not there. They're an empty space. They're so surrendered that they're not even there. Sitting there, I could barely hold his gaze. I was afraid I would dissolve right into the infinite blue of his eyes. And I was trying to remember, why am I up here? Oh yeah, I reminded myself. Gratitude, kneeling, getting a blessing. And I said into the microphone, for a long time, I've wanted to kneel in front of you. Would you please let me do that? I want to acknowledge the gratitude I feel for being able to come here. I couldn't explain it. I just yearned to kneel, to bow down, and to feel this act of devotion. I didn't even know why. It was nowhere in my upbringing. It certainly went against all of my feminist politics. For 3 years, I'd listened while other people went up to ask a question, and always my own questions were answered in time. And when I sat quietly and meditated by myself, I had the very strong image of his hand on the top of my head as I knelt down. So I knew I needed to make this step to surrender my pride and kneel in front of a genuine guide. My biggest fear was that he wouldn't allow it. I had seen him turn others away with a little joke, a kindly banter, or a verbal answer to the question that they hadn't actually asked. He didn't see himself as special. Oh, but it was so hard for us not to see him as special. So I waited. Of course, sweetheart, he said. Relief washed over me. I walked over to where he sat and I knelt. I felt his hand touch the top of my head. It was an infusion of melting compassion. My eyes filled with tears, and I heard him say, I understand, sweetheart. I understand. My gratitude was immeasurable, finally, to have found a genuine guide. According to most teachings, this is the pivotal point on your path. As Jesus Christ says in Matthew 7, "Straight is the gate and narrow is the way that leads to life, and few there be that find it." Shankara, the Hindu sage from India, 9th century. Only through God's grace may we obtain those three rarest advantages: to be born a human, to long for liberation, and to be a disciple to an illumined teacher. The 14th Dalai Lama. The direct introduction to Rigpa, pure awareness, requires that we rely upon an authentic guru who already has this experience. It is when the blessings of the guru infuse our mind stream that this direct introduction is effected. The role of a master is crucial. And Sufi poet Hafez: "Do not take a step on the path of love without a guide. I have tried it 100 times and failed." So here I was, kneeling. I had said yes to love. Saying yes to the teacher was saying yes to the light. I surrendered not to the outer person of this man, but to the light within him. Another door would open a year later when I met him at his home. We began several years of working together. The first thing he told me was that these steps of surrender are just that. They are steps. He said, devotion to a teacher is a step. Then, as you become more enlightened, you realize that what you are devoted to is the self, capital S, within the teacher. And this is not different than the self within you. At that time, no one in my life understood. "Why did you kneel in front of a guru?" they asked me. In fact, I didn't understand it myself. My heart had bowed down to this love that it knew was true. My mind, it would never understand. My partner at the time really didn't understand. After years of trying to hold on to each other despite this major upheaval, we parted ways. She had been a wonderful catalyst to liberate me from an oppressive religion. We'd been through so much together. And it was painful to realize that a romantic love relationship was not the destination in my search for love, even though it was a necessary doorway. So this kind of realization we encounter in the famous masterpiece of Sufi poet Rumi, the Mathnawi, and he shows how painful romance can be. Here's the story. A young woman was taken into the king's court and became ill. The king adored her. He was very distraught by her illness, and he stopped at nothing to get her all the necessary help. But she only got worse. And finally, she arranged for a holy man, a physician of the soul, to diagnose and heal her. As soon as he arrived, he's able to see deep into the woman's psyche. And he tells no one what he has seen. Her problem is that she's heartsick over her separation from the man she loves. So this saint, physician of the soul, goes and finds the young man that she loves, who's in a faraway village, and he brings him to the king's castle to work as a goldsmith. Well, they get together, these two lovers. They are beside themselves with joy, and guess what? The woman quickly revives. But their bliss does not last very long, because that holy man secretly injects the young man with a poison that will shrivel his physical form. He loses his virility. He loses all his good looks. Early in his decline, the young woman falls out of love with him. and she is faced with the pain of knowing that her attraction for him was based only on his physical form. It had nothing to do with his actual essence. So that was attachment. It wasn't real love. So the saint's action was cruel, you might say, but it did reveal the truth of love. That our outer attachments to another human being can never completely fulfill our longing for that which is the spiritual, changeless, and eternal. In the Sufi tradition of Rumi, the heart of hearts is a place within you and me that belongs only to the real, beloved capital B, not to a romantic lover. The only human who is allowed to enter our heart of hearts is the spiritual teacher who holds the key that unlocks its door. And that is why I say that my teacher opened my heart. My path includes human love. It includes partners and family life. Unlike some of the people I interview for this book, a celibate monastic life is not the path I'm called to. I'm not a nun. I'm not a monk. I'm not celibate. I've had to work through all of my illusions about love right in the context of an ordinary love life. Fully giving myself to a real person in flesh and blood has been a precursor to turning my life over to the reality, capital R, I cannot see. The key quality for the devotee is willingness to risk disapproval for the sake of love. And I have certainly learned that critical lesson through my personal love life. As the years have progressed, my awareness that no person can fill my soul's core longing, it put the desire for human companionship into better balance. Romantic love is wholesome. It's beautiful. But it's not strong enough to bear the heat of the deeper quest in my heart. I am so blessed to have the gift, currently, of a companion, a love mate. It's a singular joy to share my life with her. Yet the relationship with my teacher remains primary for the simple fact that it is free of all conditions, all inner limitations, emotionalisms, dependencies. His presence is the same as the light capital L. It has all-encompassing love, total, unconditional, ever-giving love. 25 years previously, I had allowed a minister's condemnation of the light to put a wedge between me and the love I was seeking. This time, I knew better. I gave my whole heart to my teacher and hoped always to abide in his.